Tonight we're going to be talking about trees for Bristol and the Bristol wider area more generally. Our first speaker tonight is going to be Nikki Jones, Chair of Avon Needs Trees. Once again, if you are joining us now, please do make sure you're on mute so that we don't have any awkward background noises interrupting Nikki while she's in full flow. Nikki, are you ready to start sharing your screen?
Sure, yes. Let me
Okay.
it says this will stop other screen sharing. Yes, continue.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, here we go. Aha. Right. Slide.
And
okay.
perfect.
Can everyone see that?
Go for it. Yes, we can see it perfectly.
Lovely. Okay. Well, what I'm going to do in about 20 minutes before I hand over to John from Bristol Tree Forum is really sort of, for the first few slides, just perhaps talk about the wider context about why, you know, I and others have set up this particular charity. It's a very new charity. We only registered in July last year, 2019. And there are very particular reasons for that, which I'd kind of like to explain. And then I'll show you where we've got to and hopefully where we're heading. But I guess I feel like I have to start every lecture or presentation that I give with the basic facts, because it's so easy for us to forget these. This is from the IPCC 1.5 report. And it's just, you know, we all need to remember that in 2018, when this was released, we were kind of where that big, thick green line is. And we expect by 2030, at least, to be where that first thin grey line is at 1.5. And you can see the higher danger zones that we're heading into in terms of threatened systems, extreme weather, large-scale singular events, and so on. So, you know, this really is urgent. There's nothing, you know, well, there's plenty we can do, but we absolutely have no time to waste on this. And it's so easy to think, especially when our governments keep talking about 2050 as a target for carbon neutrality, that that's enough. The scientists are telling us, of course, that that is nowhere near enough. And these figures, again, are taken from the IPCC 1.5 report and interpreted by Carbon Brief, and I've snuck their graph from one of their articles. And I guess it just makes the point that even before COVID, 2020 was the absolute last year that we have possible to start cutting our emissions if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees, which the scientists are telling us we absolutely must, if we are to try and keep our climate as anything stable. So basically, but of course, by, as you can see by that thick black line, by leaving it so very, very late, we have made the need for a very, very steep drop key now. We don't have a choice. If we got going earlier, we could have had a slower run at it, but we didn't. So this year really is our last possible chance. And of course, for us in the global north, it means cutting more than even in the global south. Where do trees come into this? Well, trees are part of, trees along with soil really are a part of our negative emission technologies, our natural negative emissions. And the idea, which many governments have caught on to, is the idea that if they can plant some trees and start regenerating our soil, getting more carbon back into our soil, that we can actually ease out this carbon budget a little bit. And of course, that is true. What the worrying thing here is that we have governments generally over relying on tree planting. Tree planting is absolutely necessary, and that regeneration of our soil is absolutely necessary, but that doesn't mean that we can stop cutting our fossil fuels. Every one of us needs to think about how we are going to eliminate fossil fuels from our lives within the next 10 years as early as possible. And that's the imperative on all of us. So what is our government saying? Our government's saying that we should be planting 30,000 hectares per year. But unfortunately, as you can see from the graph here, we are not reaching that by a long way, and we have a long way to go. And I think there have been some recent petitions going around by Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth calling on the government to, in fact, double its targets. So we are a long way off what we need to do. And of course, one of you know, it's interesting to see that the UK is in fact so much worse in terms of tree cover than most other countries in Europe. We only have about 13% woodland. about 100 years ago, we were actually down to about 5% around the time of the end of the First World War. But and so it's grown a little bit. But remember that about 50% of our woodland, more than 50%, is plantation. It's not native natural woodland as we would think of it. But compare us to the European average, which is closer to 40%. We are a very, very deforested country. For many reasons. And of course, the other point there, which you can see from that map, is that most of our forest is in Scotland. It's not in England or Wales or even Northern Ireland. So it's very concentrated in one particular country. And then, I guess if you're asking why did I think that setting up Avon Needs Trees was a good idea, and I always come back to this map. This is the map that I was shown by the Environment Agency. I went to a couple of talks that they were giving around the place, and this is the map of our catchment area. So the perimeter there is our watersheds. So this goes beyond the political boundaries of Avon. This is what we call the Bristol-Avon catchment area, where all the rivers, one way or another, flow down into Bristol. And you can see the dark green patches there, but you have to look for them. There are not many. And that's because we are almost entirely deforested. And of course, that has implications not just for our carbon, but also for our biodiversity crisis. It also has implications, big implications for our natural flood management. And as we've begun to see in the last few years, we are all at risk, growing risk of flooding. This has particular implications for Bristol. Bristol, of course, is at the bottom of all those rivers, and we are on a tidal river ourselves. So what we've experienced a couple of times in the last couple of years is what they call tidal lock, when we have a high incoming tide meeting a very heavy inundation inland, and we've got almost nothing to stop that inland water going straight into our watercourses and being taken straight down into our cities, and with Bristol at the bottom of them. And so we've had that flooding issue caused by that tidal lock. So it's when I went to this lecture with the Environment Agency that they were saying, really the thing to do is plant trees, hedges, get back into our, good regenerative agriculture, particularly in the high catchment area. The more we can plant in the high catchment area, the more we stop and slow water getting into our watercourses at all. And so I went off and thought about this. I'd been thinking about buying land anyway, either on my own or with some friends, and realizing there are all sorts of difficulties in this. Went off and spoke to the Environment Agency and said, is there any point in setting up a charity that actually starts to buy land? What I'm aware of course, is that there are many different organisations, and I'm absolutely not knocking what they're doing, which is to plant on other people's land. And in many ways, of course, they can move perhaps faster than we can, because we have to raise the capital for each land purchase. But what we offer, and what we felt that we really should offer our funders, is permanent woodland. So, and the only way to do that really was by buying the land. So I went off and spoke to the Environment Agency. They said, yes, go do it, please. We'll back you with a letter of support. No money, of course, but please go ahead and do it. So that's what we've embarked on. And I would just say, so just another slide here, just looking at Bristol in particular, in terms of that natural flood management, just remember how low-lying most of Bristol is. The centre of Bristol, the area where I live in around the Trim, very, very low-lying. This is at sea level. This picture in the bottom left actually is taken from 2016 in Bristol, and it's just a reminder of how quickly we forget these things. There have been flooding incidents since then, in fact, but we so easily forget these once they're out of the news again, and if they haven't affected us directly. But this is an increasing risk for all of us. And the other point to say, you may have read that Bristol City Council is now embarking on a massive, extremely expensive, and I forget the figures, something like £20 billion of flood defences within Bristol, which are mainly walls. These are engineered defences. These are much more expensive, in fact, than natural flood management. And we have the experience of many towns and cities around our country going for natural flood management and cutting their flood management bills quite substantially by doing that, and quite effectively. So I guess you'll understand that and come back with questions afterwards if you need to ask more. Of course, the other reason that one of the reasons that we're all very interested in trees is the carbon sequestration. And I'm often asked how much carbon can a tree sequester. And I think this picture here, which I've nicked off the internet, this lady next to a 12-metre sycamore is quite a good example. So that's basically about a ton of carbon, which represents, because of the molecular weight, about almost 4 tons of carbon dioxide in that biomass of that tree. So you can see how much is there. The point about woodland, though, is not, of course, that biomass in that tree is extremely valuable, and everything else growing in that woodland. But one of the beauties of woodland is the soil below the trees, that if you look at that bottom picture, and it's a scene we're all very familiar with in this country, as the leaves fall every winter, and that those leaves, leaf litter as it's called, is turned by microbials back into soil, very carbon rich soil. We build up that soil carbon, and because it's in a woodland, you can't plough it, you can't turn it over, and so it basically protects it. If you look at the average woodland, the soil below the trees will hold between 3 and 4 times as much carbon as the trees themselves. So it's actually the protective value that the trees give that's so very important. In terms of, it's just, sorry, are you admitting people? Just to, again, I won't bore you with all the figures here, it's probably too much to read, but again, just to say the age structure of our woodland in our country is all wrong. We had a bit of a tree planting binge in the 1980s and then stopped, and that means that we're now, if you look at the carbon that is sequestered in our woodland, it actually reached a peak in 2019, and we're now, because of the age structure of our woodland, actually losing carbon from our woodland overall at the moment. And as I said earlier, the other thing to remember is that most of this woodland is not what we would call woodland. It's not native broadleaf woodland. The vast majority of it, over 50%, is plantation, designed for forestry, designed to be cut down, in fact, and not good for biodiversity. And I guess that comes on to the other great reason for creating more woodland, and it is to do with our biodiversity crisis. And I've just taken some of these quotes from Benedict MacDonald's Rebirding, which if nobody's read, or if you haven't read, I would highly, highly recommend. If you want to understand what has happened in our countryside and why we face such an ecological crisis in our country, this is probably the most direct and most accessible book that I've found anyway. And I think perhaps that quote in the middle is perhaps the clearest one. We, of course, in our country have spent centuries removing our top predators. You know, we don't have bears and lynx and wolves and so on, and that has implications for the animals then that graze on and to an extent destroy our trees. But we've spent the last 50, 60 years killing off all our microbials and our insects, mainly through our agricultural production, our intensive agricultural production, our pesticides and so on. And so we are now losing everything in the middle. We've taken out that top and bottom layer, and now we're losing everything in the middle. We're suddenly seeing our butterflies, our birds, our hedgehogs, and so on go. And it is because of these rural deserts. That's the problem. We can all, and we should be, doing what we can in our gardens, planting our pollinators, putting in ponds and all the rest of it. The real crux of the issue is, if we want to stop this, and if we want to have any chance of reversing this species loss that we are experiencing now, we need to change our food consumption and our food distribution. And that means, yes, we have to buy more organic. Yes, we have to buy more seasonal. Yes, we have to buy more local. But organic is certainly a very big part of it. And for most of us, that means changing our diet to accommodate perhaps what are sometimes slightly higher costs, but can usually be done. And I'm happy to answer questions on that. But it's those rural deserts that we've got so used to out in our countryside, and we think are traditional Britain, but are not. They're what we've grown up with, but there's nothing alive out there. That's the problem. So, of course, there are many other reasons to set up this charity. And one of them really is, of course, to do exactly what I'm doing now. And it is to engage the public and to get people to understand the multiple crises that we face at the moment. And the wonderful thing about the land that we've bought and has been, in fact, the outpouring of public enthusiasm for it. It has been quite a surprise, a lovely surprise, and very, very heartwarming. People really need positive green projects for their mental and their physical health. and they need to get out there. They need that element of hope as well. And so there is a real value to what we're doing. And I know many others are doing great stuff as well. It is, as I kind of hinted at it, this is about adaptation as well as mitigation of climate change. Climate change is here. We are all going to face it. We need to bring in that natural flood management. We need to produce more food on our land, and on both the pieces of land, that with the one that we've bought and the one that we're about to buy, we will be planting orchards so that there is some food production there. We all know we've got an air quality crisis and water quality crisis, and so on. And again, that need for public amenity space. We really have a public health crisis too. So what are we doing? As I say, we've only been going, really, we registered July last year, so I guess we're about 18 months old now, and we've raised almost $750,000, and that is very much due to public enthusiasm, and we are thrilled by that. We've had some great support from companies, and of course about $250,000 from the lottery fund, the National Heritage Lottery Fund, for which we're extremely grateful. And that's enabled us to buy Hazeland, which is between Chippenham and Carn. And I hope many of you will come and visit in the near future. COVID is messing everything up at the moment, but it is a wonderful site. Everybody falls in love with it when they see it. It is a fantastic starter project for us, partly because there's already 10 acres of ancient woodland there, very neglected and in not good health, that needs management. And then we've got a wonderful area of wet woodland, old canals, ponds, and so on, where we've got otters and other endangered species. We've got a wonderful riverside meadow along the Marden. The Marden tips into the Avon just at Chippenham, so we're just upstream from that. And then we've got 3 other fields, which, apart from our riverside meadow, which we will be planting and rewilding to create new permanent woodland. So it's a wonderful project, and I do hope you'll come and see it. I'm going to, and as we get that project underway, we've just employed a project coordinator to start devising all sorts of activities to entice you onto the land and to come and see it. We've got a bird monitoring project in January. We've got lots of tree planting days coming up, and other volunteer days, and we'll be having all sorts of biodiversity events across the year. We're now getting going on buying our second piece of land, and we're more than halfway there now, but we still have quite a lot to raise. This is at Seend near Melksham, and we're buying it for all the same reasons that we've bought Hazeland: natural flood management, carbon, biodiversity. This is land where we can really add value. Great springs, great hedgerows, 3 fields that are just ideal. They're species poor, and they're really ideal for a bit of tree planting. We'll have community orchard there, as well as woodland and meadow. So there's lots we can do there. So if you would like to help us, we need all the help we can get with fundraising, please. We have Christmas gift cards and Seend cards. That one in the bottom left is a card that you can buy for other people. We'll send it for you, so it makes Christmas giving very easy. £2.50 buys a square metre, and we ask for a donation of minimum of £10, and then we'll send it to the person that you want us to and tell them how many square metres you've bought for them. So please look on our website and order that if you'd like to. Yeah, so I'm going to cut it short there, because I know John's got lots to say, particularly about Bristol tree planting, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end if that's useful. Thank you. Okay,
perfect. Thank you very much, Nikki. Yes, John, are you ready to start sharing your slides?
Okay, well, I always worry about following Nikki, because she always gives such a fantastic talk, and I always think, oh, it's so boring by comparison, but anyway, let's give it a go anyway. So anyway, I'm going to be mostly talking about Bristol and the influence of urban trees. Obviously, a tree is a tree, but there are particular issues around urban trees. In Bristol, there's around about 500,000 trees, approximately. It's always going to be pretty rough, but around about that sort of number. You might think that that's quite a high number, but bearing in mind the amount of carbon emissions that you get in Bristol, which is probably about 1 million tonnes equivalent of CO2, you would actually need something like 500 million mature trees to regularly sequester that level of carbon. So even though the levels of trees in Bristol, and generally in cities, in actual fact, and one of the interesting things is, and I'm going to talk about later about the In fact, down here you can see the amount of trees. The city average of trees is around about 16%. So when you look at Nikki's previous slide of an overall average over the whole country of about 13%, you realise that actually cities, generally speaking, are reasonably well covered with trees. Anyway, Bristol City Council, they manage about 54,000 trees. So most of the trees, as you can see, are privately owned, ones that are in people's gardens and so on. So there's a thing called the eye tree, which gives you the level of tree canopy in Bristol. The level in Bristol is 18.4, which is pretty good for a city. As I say, the city average is about 16%. There are many cities that are better, quite a few that are worse. Manchester's quite good at 21, Birmingham's quite good at 23. Hull, which is where I come from originally, that's a mere 13. So obviously they need to do a little bit better than they're doing at the moment. Okay, so why plant a tree? Well, Nikki's talked about some of the issues, and these relate obviously to city and town trees as much as country trees. Something like a very large mature oak tree, such as the one you see on the right of the screen there, can be the equivalent of more than 200 tons of CO2, a phenomenal amount of CO2. So that's round about 200 passenger return transatlantic flights. So they have a massive value in themselves in terms of carbon sequestration. Despite advances in carbon capture and so on, the trees still represent the most efficient way of capturing carbon from the atmosphere. As things stand, it's still probably the best way of doing that. Whether that will continue to be the case, I don't know. And planting trees is enormously important. It doesn't necessarily solve all our problems because you do have to plant enormous numbers of trees. But a recent scientific report in the journal Science, which is it's probably the American equivalent to Nature, showed that if we were to plant trees in all the places that it's possible to plant trees, and that doesn't include agricultural land, it doesn't include urban spaces, things that are being used for other purposes, land that's being used for other purposes, we could absorb something like about 2/3 of the carbon that's been produced in the last century. Unfortunately, in order to do that, we have to plant trillions of trees, and I'm afraid there are no plans to go anywhere near that kind of level of tree planting. But anyway, it makes the point that tree planting can be an important part of the solution, but I would certainly suggest it's not the only solution. There has to be other solutions as well. So as well as carbon sequestration, particularly important in cities, support for ecosystems. Bristol, as well as having a climate emergency, has got an ecological emergency. And one of the crucial things that city trees are able to do is support ecosystems. And particularly, as I say on the next point here, contribute to urban connectivity. So where you get parks and green spaces within the city, things like street trees and garden trees can act as an absolutely crucial link between them. So in supporting ecosystems, I think trees are enormously important. So specifically talking about trees in the urban environment, they can mitigate pollution, city pollution, air pollution in particular. Trees can improve air quality by absorbing and adsorbing gaseous things like nitrogen dioxide and particulate pollution. They can also reduce traffic noise, which is a big problem in a lot of areas around roads in particular. And on the right here, you can see this is a map of those areas that have actually exceeded what is supposed to be the legal maximum for nitrogen dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And you can see a lot of it is concentrated around the roads around the city centre. You can see some coming up Gloucester Road here. There's a spot here on Muller Road. And if you go down to Hotwells, that's also one of the worst spots for air pollution. These are places where they've actually exceeded the legal limits, and trees will help to absorb some of that. Generally speaking, they improve urban living. They'll reduce things like flooding, and they do this by a number of mechanisms. They slow down the rate of ground flow, so the rate at which the water will flow over the ground. They increase the ground penetration because they have roots that kind of penetrate right down into the soil, so they allow kind of movement of water down into the soil. And they actually intercept rainfall, and anyone who's stood underneath a tree under in a rainstorm will understand that that is somewhat dry underneath a tree. And even though a lot of that water will eventually hit the ground, on average, there's something like about 30% less water hits the ground underneath a tree than you would find in the surrounding area. A lot of that it then re-evaporates before it actually reaches the ground. Trees also reduce excess heat in cities. They reduce this heat island effect, and they can do that by something like around about 5 degrees in some cases. So as our cities become hotter and hotter with climate change, it will be an important factor in mitigating this. So this is by shading, but also by evapotranspiration. So the natural process that the trees have of releasing water through transpiration actually has a cooling effect as well. And of course, we all know the improved physical and mental well-being in an urban environment. So sort of mental health and things like that is something that is enormously improved by trees. So a number of ways we can plant trees. Planting specimen trees, this is in streets and parks. That's probably the things that we most concentrate on. Now, unfortunately, since the tree replacement budget in 2014 was repurposed by George Ferguson and was actually transferred to the One Tree Per Child initiative, which some of you may have heard of, it does mean that any trees that are felled in parks or in the streets are no longer automatically replaced. Most of these then have to be replaced by sponsorship. So I'll talk about this first of all. So the tree sponsorship, this is organised by a part of Bristol City Council, Tree Bristol. These are basically what you do is you offer to sponsor a tree. And on the right here, we've got a map showing where all the current sponsorship sites are. So there's quite a large number of sponsorship sites. These are all Bristol City Council approved sites. So these are only sites that the Bristol City Council have themselves put on the sponsorship website. These cost £295 per tree. You can pay an extra £30 to have a plaque put on the tree, or at least on the cage which surrounds the tree in the first few years. I think that plaque then disappears, so it doesn't stay there long term. But if you, I mean, it's a particularly good thing if you wanted to have a memorial tree. It does mean that you can have Auntie Doris's name on the tree without kind of, and know that it's not just an anonymous tree. It includes the tree, it includes the planting of the tree, it includes stakes and the cage that surrounds it, but also crucially, it also supports 2 years of maintenance. And if the tree fails, as around about 5% of them do, it will also pay for a replacement tree. So that's quite a good scheme to have. I don't know whether you can see it on the right-hand side here. We've got, this is from our Trees of Bristol website, which I'll talk about later. But the two areas that we're interested here, Bishopston and Clifton, you can see there's a few sponsorship sites in Bishopston, but unfortunately at the moment there are no sponsorship sites in Clifton that I could see. So this is quite variable depending on what part of the city you're living in. So the other way that trees get planted is through Section 106 money. Now this is money that developers give if they feel that they're forced, and we try and stop them from doing this if at all possible, but if they are forced to fell a tree on the site and they're not able to replace it on their own site, they will then pay Bristol City Council a nominal £750 to replace the tree somewhere within a mile radius of the site where the tree's been removed. So that money is paid to Bristol City Council, and then Bristol City Council then will replace the tree within a mile radius of that site. The administration of that is overseen by the area committees, so that's sort of kind of part of the administration of the of Bristol City Council. Now there's all sorts of advantages to that. We did find that the Bristol City Council had actually accumulated something like about £750,000 worth of trees which they hadn't actually got round to planting. So one of the things we did in the Bristol Tree Forum is we encouraged them to plant a load of trees, which they actually did a few hundred of those this year, but they need to kind of get on with using that money. Another way that you can have a tree planted is in a new site. Now this is much more difficult and much more expensive, because what you need to do is you need to create an engineered tree pit most of the time. You have to do a services check to make sure that you're not digging a hole through somebody's internet cable or sewage pipe or whatever. So that represents an administrative expense. So that can amount to something like about £3,000 per tree. So it's a lot more expensive to plant a tree using this means, which is why it's so important, if there is a tree site, if say you lose a tree and there's a tree stump there, make sure that Bristol City Council keep a record of that site. Usually they'll leave a stump there, in which case it's not a problem. But if that stump gets removed and they tarmac over it, you can actually lose that as a site, and therefore suddenly it becomes a lot more expensive. The other source of money is the community infrastructure levy. That money usually gets spent by the council on things other than trees, because they say it's the Section 106 money, which is really meant specifically for trees in this case. So they tend not to spend SIL money on trees. An important person in the whole of Bristol, when you're talking about tree felling and tree planting, is your local tree officer. The tree officer we have in our area is Beth Garman. I know Ian Clark, who's a very good chap, he's very keen on tree planting. He deals with South Bristol. I don't know what, I think Bishopston is also Beth Garman. I don't know what Clifton is, but the tree officer is a really important person to have a reasonably good relationship with. The other way you can plant trees is by mass tree planting projects, and I mentioned this One Tree Per Child project, which is a very good project. I mean, it's was originally meant to plant 30,000 trees. They think that maybe it's now up to around about 60,000. It was extended, the original lifetime of this was extended somewhat. What we don't know is how many of these have survived. They tend to be mostly whips that are planted, and their survival rate may be considerably lower than it would be with a specimen tree, and it may well be, you know, as low as 10%. We basically just don't have any idea what the survival rate is. So we may find that it's not quite as productive in terms of mature trees eventually as other trees would be, tree per tree. The chap who looks after this project is John Atkinson. He's a really useful chap to know. He's very pro-tree and is really helpful and cooperative. And if you do want to plant any trees via the One Tree Per Child mechanism in the grounds of a school or something like that, he's a crucial person to speak to. There's also an initiative, One Tree Per Employee. This is something which is a company-sponsored scheme. Aims to plant around about 250,000 trees by 2030. I think they're substantially below that in terms of what they've managed to achieve so far. The last I saw was somewhat over 3,000. And this is administered through the Forest of Avon Trust, a chap called John Clark. Okay, so I also thought I'd tell you about what the Bristol Tree Forum does. It was formed in 2007, 2008, and this was to support the Plant a Tree in 73 legacy. There was a number of people that had kind of taken on this legacy, but this came to a bit of a head in 2005 when Bristol City Council decided they were going to do a mapping of all of the trees in Bristol. And as a result of this mapping, they discovered that all of these trees were damaged, or a lot of these trees were damaged or were diseased, and they had a mass cull of trees. So they got rid of hundreds and hundreds of trees as a result of this process. So the Bristol Tree Forum really formed as a defence of these trees. We aim to be a critical friend of Bristol City Council. We do have lots of contact with Bristol City Council. Unfortunately, sometimes we're rather too critical for their liking, and we have fallen out with them on a number of occasions on tree issues, but that's what we try and maintain, a reasonably good relationship. One of the things we do is we scan planning applications. So any development application which proposes the felling of trees, we will have a look at that, and if appropriate, we will object to that. And this is something you can help with. And if you go onto the Bristol City, onto Bristol Tree Forum website, there is a portal there to get to the Bristol City's Council's development site. but we'll also give you a kind of a guidelines as to how you can go about putting in objections and so on, and how you can do searches to find development sites in your area that are relevant to trees. In many cases, when there are developments, we will advocate a tree preservation order, and we've got many tree preservation orders that we've managed to have awarded to trees, but we could always do with more. We also organise a network of tree champions, so local people who are very keen to look after trees, and if there's anyone in Clifton or in Bishopston who'd like to get involved in that, we'd be really keen to get them involved. We partner strategic green infrastructure and tree planting initiatives, provide a voice in support of trees in strategic decisions that Bristol City Council and others will be involved in. Annually, we meet with senior council officers and council cabinet members at our AGM, which is our main public meeting that we have once a year. And we have then the opportunity to network with the council officers and councillors and really take them to task on how they've been performing in terms of their management of trees. We also engage in any major fundraising bids that might be happening. And here you can see some people planting trees in 1979. As you can see, the standard of tree planters was a lot higher than it is today. People used to get dressed up specially for that purpose. I don't think you'll find that now. Maddie, having said that, I did have the Freemasons sponsor a tree on Redland Green, and they all turned up to do their planting, all dressed in their suits and their best shoes. And I did point out it's probably not the most appropriate clothing to wear. But. So our achievements, one of the things we achieved is development of Bristol Tree Replacement Standard. And this is whenever you do get developments having to fell trees, if that tree is a larger tree, they will replace more than one. I don't know whether you can see it on the right-hand side here, but if it's less than a 15 centimetre diameter tree trunk, they will replace it with one. But subsequently, as the tree gets bigger, they'll replace it with more and more. So if it's greater than 80 centimetre diameter, you may replace as many as 8 trees. So this does mean that you don't just get a one-for-one replacement, you get a greater replacement of trees, which is a very good thing. We've raised quite a lot of money for tree planting, around about £70,000, one of which was a university sponsorship. And you can see on the right here a map of the trees, or most of the trees. We didn't actually record necessarily all of them, but most of the trees that were planted as part of that, that initiative. A couple of years ago, Bristol City Council tried to slash their tree maintenance budget, which meant that they would be starting to fell trees instead of maintain them. And we persuaded them to reverse that. We made the point that you only need to have one tree branch landing on top of a tree with a number of BMWs parked underneath, and you will immediately cancel out any benefit they might have got from slashing their tree budget. And eventually they did see sense, and they did actually reverse that. We've helped to develop the Green Infrastructure Core Policy, which you'll see as part of the Bristol City Council's core development policy. We've commented on over 1,000 developments involving trees. Not all of them have been successful, but we've had a reasonable amount of success. We've organised hundreds of tree plantings through Section 106 money, making sure that Bristol City Council release these. And we've developed our Trees of Bristol website, which if you can go onto that, it's a really useful thing to do. We have a Bristol Tree Forum website, of which there's an enormous amount of information, all sorts of things you might want to know about planting trees in Bristol, about different initiatives that we have. You have a number of blogs on there, people involved in the Tree Forum ranting about various things, which can be quite entertaining. The other thing I mentioned is the Trees of Bristol website. This is a phenomenal resource. It's Chris Wallace is the chap who runs this, and he's put a lot of work into this, a number of different elements to it. And I'll just run through a few of these. If you wanted to search individual tree sites, different tree collections, you can do that. One of these that's particularly relevant in Clifton, you probably heard that Bristol Zoological Gardens is going to be closing down. And we've been in quite intense communications with the association to make it such that actually the trees that they have on site won't be lost, and they seem quite sympathetic to that. But if you want to go onto the site and see the trees that they have on there, we are actually going to be going on site fairly soon and cataloguing all of the trees that aren't actually mentioned on the site as it stands at the moment. And we're hoping to be able to catalogue all of those, possibly get tree preservation orders on all of them. And Bristol Zoological Society have said that they plan to keep all of the trees, and the only buildings that will be put up will occupy the footprint which is already occupied by buildings. So that's quite an enlightened approach. The other thing you can do is look at particular species. On this one here, I've shown where these are all of the English oak that you have in the kind of Bishopston, Redland area. So if you want to look at a particular tree species, if you wanted to search where all the tree preservation orders are, and I think there's something like about 4,000 of those in Bristol currently, so you can search where all of those are individually, so see where they are. If you want to look at the detailed tree canopy, you can see here, this is the whole of Bristol area, so that's around about 18% tree canopy. Clifton is quite good. The tree canopy in the Bishopston and Ashley Down area is 10.7, so that's actually quite low compared to the rest of the city. So that's something we might want to think about, see if we can get some more trees in those areas. And the other thing that I'd like to push is our carbon calculator. This is something that we've developed to try and encourage developers and Bristol City Council to retain trees, rather than just thinking about tree replacement as being sufficient mitigation for the loss of trees. And if you go onto our carbon calculator, it's great fun because you can adjust all of these different parameters to see what the results come out with. And what we've got here, we've got a 40 centimetre tree here, a number of different parameters relating to the individual tree. So we've made an assumption that this is going to be replaced using the Bristol Tree Replacement Standard, which means in this case it'll actually be replaced by 4 trees. Now the remarkable thing is, even if you replace this one tree by 4 trees, it will be about nearly 40 years before you recover the carbon that was lost through the loss of that single tree. And you can reverse that logic, and you can actually go on to, you can say, well, I want to be carbon neutral, say in 20 years. So that's what we've set here. So we've set a carbon neutrality of 20 years. And so what you do is you set that, and then what it will do is it will calculate how many trees you'll have to replace that single tree with in order to be carbon neutral within 20 years. And in this case, it's 10 trees. If, say, you want to be carbon neutral by 2030, which is what Bristol City Council is planning to be, actually that can go up to something like about 40 trees. So every tree that's felled, you have to replace it with something like about 40 trees. Now, this isn't to say that developers should do that, but to make the point to developers, actually retaining trees is the most important thing that you can do, rather than thinking all the time of mitigating that by replacing trees elsewhere. Okay, and that's me done, and back to you. Any questions?
Yeah, that's great. Any questions? My God, we've got so many questions. We've got some brilliant questions. I'm just going to quickly flash this back up on the screen. I don't imagine many of you are planning on leaving because we have got a lot of really interesting questions, but some people do tend to leave as soon as the speakers have finished and the questions begin. So just a reminder, please check out our websites, check out all the different things we've got going on. And what I didn't mention at the beginning was that if you really enjoyed tonight's talk, you feel like you got something useful out of it, we would really appreciate your donations through paypal.me/Clifton Climate Action. And yeah, there's been some discussion of whether we end up, because it's Christmas, kind of, whether we end up donating that money to the organizations who've been talking to us tonight. But otherwise, it will get split between the 2 groups, as the donations from all of our other talks have been. So yeah, either way, you either get more talks or you get more trees. So it's a win-win. So let me bring up these questions. Where did they go? Where does the chat box go? There it is. Okay. So yeah, absolutely heaps of these, and they're all really, really good ones. So let me make this a bit bigger for myself. Okay, so there was some... Yes, so we talked about this a little bit, about tree maintenance. I understand the cost of the council for tree watering is significant, and there isn't going to be much money around in the next few years. How can communities step in when the quantities of water needed for young trees are quite large? Nikki, I know you've done some guerrilla tree planting, and I've seen you carrying buckets of water around Stoke Bishop. You are currently muted, but do you want to tackle that one, or should we leave that to John?
Well, I think John should probably answer the general question, but yes, in the end, I do think yes, about 700 trees were planted near me by one tree per child at Sea Mills, and around March, April, I realised that most of them were dying because of the drought, and actually nobody was controlling the weeds around them. So I did get a whole bunch of volunteers together, and we were all going down there with bottles of water and flagons of water and God knows what. And luckily a local councillor who had unmetered water eventually very kindly threw a hose over a few days a week for us, and we met down there and kept the trees watered, and most of them actually have survived. The ones that were further away haven't survived. But so yes, I do think it's a bigger issue. John, you might want to answer this generally.
Yeah, sure. The trees that are planted by Bristol City Council for the £295, that does include 2 years of watering. That's not to say that that's always enough, or not always say it's always effective. If you do see any trees that are really suffering, and I've done that myself on a number of occasions, if you get in touch with us, we can then pass that information on to John Atkinson, who is the chap who will be doing those tree waterings. A bit like Nikki, I've spent many an hour wandering around Redland Green carrying buckets of water, watering the trees that we have planted. They're not quite guerrilla plantings, some of them are, but most of them are with the agreement of Bristol City Council. But very often what we do is we will plant trees on Redland Green at a fraction of the cost that it would cost if we did it through the council. But it does mean that you don't have that maintenance cost associated with it. So we do have to do all of our waterings, and I think we've only ever had one failure. Larger trees tend to require more water because, generally speaking, if you imagine a tree is going to be normally about the same size underneath the ground as it is above the ground. If you plant a tree which has a root ball which is the size of a pot, it's not going to be able to extract the water it needs to survive. So it will need quite a lot of water, probably for the first 2 years. And if there's any drought periods, I think you need to give it quite a good sloshing, maybe every couple of days. Generally speaking, smaller trees and whips survive reasonably well, but if you do get a drought, they will need watering, as Nikki points out. And I think quite a lot of them do fail just because they aren't watered during a drought period.
Sorry, muted myself there for a second. That was great. Thank you very much for that. We've got a couple of questions on natural flood management here, and I'm going to bunch them together because I think it's a very interesting topic. So the first one, I'm going to do these in reverse order, actually. So the first one is from Maggie. I've just come from a town with high flood risk and was a flood action group member, and we needed walls and natural flood management. It's not as simple as it sounds. So I guess part one of this question is, is anybody suggesting that trees alone is ever going to be enough to adapt to our new flood likely lifestyles that we're going to be in a few years? That's sort of part one. The next bit was sort of, are there any examples of places, this is from Nick, that have pursued natural flood management and actually managed to be successful and save money? And then Julie asked, what can we do to help convince the council to switch from focusing entirely on walls and artificial flood management and look more at natural flood management? So I can repeat those if necessary. But first of all, natural flood management. Good?
Should I go for this, John, and you can follow up?
Yeah,
I mean, yes, okay, you're absolutely right. And first of all, we're not just talking about trees when we talk about natural flood management. We're talking about swales, about hedging, about meandering rivers, allowing rivers to flood a natural floodplain. At the moment, most landowners don't want to allow their rivers to flood on their land because of whatever they're doing on that land, and so they canalize, as they call it. They canalize rivers, which means that the water flows much quicker downstream, so causing all sorts of problems. So it's not just trees alone. There are all sorts of different methods of natural flood management. Are they enough? You're absolutely right. I think it was Maggie who asked that question. In many cases, they won't be, particularly in the time frame that we've now left ourselves. You know, half of Britain now is suffering from severe flood risk, and we've left it so very late. Maybe if we'd got going on this, you know, 10, 15 years ago, we would have many more options than we have now. I suspect that you're right. It would depend completely on which urban area you're talking about, but most are probably going to need a combination of engineered solutions and natural flood management. But certainly natural flood management has proved, generally, my understanding is, to be very cost effective. But what you generally have to do is, of course, we are just ants. That's why we called ourselves Avon Needs Trees. We are just ants. We're not saying that we can solve the whole Bristol flooding problem. I wish we could, but, you know, we can nibble away and pick up chunks of land that are going to make a local impact and will have an impact on the greater catchment area in terms of natural flood management. We are not, Avon Needs Trees is not going to solve this problem, and it's going to need a much bigger minds than that. In terms of examples, there is actually, I would really recommend people look back on the Costing the Earth, the Radio 4 website, and there was a program about 6 months ago, and they have got good archives, so you should be able to find it quite easily, which was just looking at natural flood management, and that had lots of examples in there. And lots of really good debate from both sides. So I would certainly advise looking at that. They were looking at one Cumbrian town, and the name escapes me at the moment, which is literally at the moment threatened with it's a beautiful little picturesque town village, and at the moment it's threatened with a whopping great wall right down the middle of it. You know, so the locals are sort of saying, surely there has to be another solution here, and it appears that there is. In answer to Julie's question about how do we convince the council to look more, I mean, John may be able to answer this better than I can. I suspect the issue here, because I started out talking to Bristol City Council about if they were going to meet their 2030 carbon targets, they were going to need some negative emissions, and therefore why not reap the added benefits of a bit of natural flood management and better air quality and so on by planting outside of Bristol as well as inside Bristol. And I suspect this is a political difficulty. They completely understood what I was saying and they completely agreed with me, but no money came forward. And I think it is because, from their point of view, Bristol City Council does not want to spend money outside of Bristol, which is what it would involve. There's not that. This is my feeling, it's a political thing. They do not have that level of cooperation, and you know, the money, they want to keep it within Bristol, and I'm sure every other area is the same.
Isn't that what we got a sodding combined authority for?
Well, you might think so, but yeah, yes, it should be coordinating things like that, indeed. John, do you want to add in? You've got more of a local political perspective on this than I do.
Well, yeah, I think you're quite right in saying that by the time the water gets down to Bristol, it's a little bit too late. It needs to be done up in the hills rather than wait until it's reached the place where the flooding actually does most of its damage. And I think, you know, exactly what you're doing, which is planting trees within the river catchment areas, is exactly what you need to do. I think in terms of carbon offsetting, if you're talking about carbon offsetting by tree planting, it's very difficult to achieve that within Bristol, to be able to plant the numbers of trees that are required. And I've kind of promoted the idea of doing carbon offsetting, not just in the UK, but, you know, in other countries as well. But certainly if you want to do some carbon offsetting of, you know, carbon producing initiatives and things that happen in Bristol, actually planting those trees within the catchment area has the added benefit of reducing flooding. So I would say it's the way to go. I think in terms of making a difference to flooding within Bristol, we have made the point on a number of occasions, particularly in high flood risk areas, that actually planting trees might not be a bad idea. But I think it kind of falls on deaf ears, really. unfortunately.
Yeah. I think I think I'm reading this correctly. I think the town that Maggie was saying that she came from that needed walls and NFM is Pickering in North Yorkshire. So if anyone wants to do further reading on natural flood management and the pros and cons, definitely look up that Costing the Earth episode and maybe see what you can read about Pickering. So this is one, I don't know if you two are going to disagree on this, or we might have a bit of a fight, I don't know. But is inner city street tree planting useful, or is it better to invest in planting trees together and focus on larger woodland areas? Now, I'm assuming we're not going to say that what John is fighting for is completely pointless, but is it a mix of both, or is one clearly better than the other?
I think it's just we need both. It's
Right.
the bottom line. We absolutely need both. I mean, I think John made a really good case for we need urban trees. We need them for cooling, and we're going to need that much more going ahead. We need it for air quality. We need it for sound proofing and so on. There are so many advantages of having trees in the city. But just as I've outlined, there are so many good reasons to make woodland outside the city. So I don't think we're going to fall out over this. I think both are absolutely needed. Yeah, we have to get going.
Well, yes, one of the things that Bristol Tree Forum did, we donated some money to Avon Needs Trees because we saw the value in that as well. I think the stat that I gave earlier, which is the fact that most cities actually have a higher canopy cover than does the country as a whole. So we shouldn't kind of dismiss the importance of city trees. They do represent a reasonably large number of trees. So I think, you know, what Nikki says, there are specific advantages to having trees within cities. And I think the ecological connectivity is an important thing, particularly for street trees. Because I think even within cities, you're talking about street trees, you're talking about garden trees, and you're talking about park trees. I think the street trees, they're fairly few and far between compared to the others, but I think their value is probably disproportionate because they do represent what is potentially a wildlife corridor in the sky, if you like, for ecological connectivity, and I think that's an important element.
Yeah, that's great, John. I mean, I thank you for bringing up that stat again about cities actually having a higher sort of proportion of trees than countryside. It sounds bonkers, but then when you think about those majestic rolling hills and you think, actually, I don't remember seeing any trees there. So it actually does make a lot of sense, but it seems so backwards the first time you hear it. Tim, your question is very technical, and I'm not sure I fully understand it, so I'm afraid I'm going to skip that one and come back to it if we have time, because there's a really interesting question here I definitely wanted to ask, which was to Nikki about ash dieback. Mm-hmm. What are you doing to factor in the need to manage ash dieback?
Yeah, no, it's a really tricky one, particularly in landscapes where there is public access, and so you've got to figure in the public safety issue. And of course, like all organizations, nobody wants to get sued because trees suddenly come down on somebody. So what do we do? Yes, I mean, certainly at Hazeland, the 34 acres where we've got the ancient woodland, ash dieback is moving much faster than we anticipated, even than when we first saw the land, almost 2 years ago. It is certainly taking a hold, and what we have to do is we have to have a tree survey done. We manage it as conservatively as we can, so we try to leave standing deadwood. We try not to take down trees where we absolutely don't have to, where we are cordoning off whole areas of woodland so that they are not accessible to the public, so that they can be allowed to do their own thing, but we'll have to keep an eye on them. I mean, I think from talking to various, again, John will have views on this, but we've been talking to a university researcher at Reading University who's been doing research into ash dieback and the use of biochar in particular, and we asked his advice. And he said the trouble is, at the moment, this is still really quite early in the UK, and we don't know. There are many trees that are exhibiting signs of ash dieback, and it's possible that we're taking them down prematurely because in fact, many of them are actually, even though they're showing signs, they're actually quite resistant, and they're managing to cope quite well for quite a number of years, and hold steady. So, really, we don't know enough at the moment about ash dieback. I mean, it's really only been, I think, John, again, will correct me if I'm wrong, but only really got going in the southwest in the last 2 to 3 years. Up until then, we thought it was really going to be confined to the southeast, and now it's spread throughout the country. And remember, that's about a third of our trees across the country that we are very, very likely to lose in the next few years, one way or another. So yes, we have to manage for that. So we're trying to be as ecologically aware as possible and keep that carbon locked up as long as possible, but we do have to factor in public safety as well.
Yeah, I think the science at the moment suggests that something like about 5% of ash trees will be resistant. It's a genetic thing, and it's what they say has got 50% penetrance, which means that if you have the gene, it's a 50-50 chance that you will that the tree, the offspring, will inherit the resistance genes. So it's really important that any trees that are resistant to ash dieback are retained. So the idea of felling a tree as soon as it shows any signs of ash dieback, and I think particularly we had some discussions over the autumn. Some people were claiming they could see ash dieback on trees that were losing their leaves in the autumn, and we did point out that's probably because it's the autumn, and it was surrounded by other trees. Like there's clearly a bad case of sycamore dieback as well going on at the moment. So I think retaining trees, even if they are affected by ash dieback, because it may well be that they are ultimately resistant. I think in terms of trees within Bristol, I think it's a big elephant in the room, because even though not many street trees are ash, quite a lot of the trees in green spaces are ash trees. And I'm actually in the process of writing a letter to the Downs Management Committee, trying to encourage them to have a preemptive sequential planting of trees that are likely to die as a result of ash dieback. And it's around about 25%, I think, of trees on the Downs are ash. Tends to be not the specimen trees, but the ones in woodland. And I think normally what happens is the Downs assume that those trees, you're going to get a natural succession. But unfortunately, the trees that would naturally succeed are also ash. So all of the small trees that are growing in the undercover are also ash trees. So I'm going to encourage them, if we can, to maybe get a preemptive succession planting on the Downs to take account of the fact that they're probably going to be losing perhaps 25% of their trees in the next decade. And I think really in other open spaces we ought to consider a similar strategy. Let's start planting the trees now. And to be honest, if the ash tree doesn't die, well, all we've done is we've just got an extra tree, so no harm done there.
That's great. Just to say, we are coming up close to 9:15. I'm sure we could all talk about this for ages, but I think we probably should try and wrap up by 9. If we don't get to everyone's questions, we will try and come up with a solution to get answers for all of the good ones. I'm not quite sure what that will be, but we will come up with something. But just because you brought up the Downs there, John, actually, we got a question specifically about the Downs, which somebody literally asked, just thinking about the way that a local area I visit every day is managed, the Downs. How would you like to see it managed? More trees as it is now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you could probably triple or even quadruple the number of trees without actually affecting the way the Downs functions. Any of the leisure activities that go on the Downs wouldn't be affected by that at all. Unfortunately, the Downs seem to have this idyllic idea of what the Downs should look like, which is kind of circa 1820, with kind of sheep grazing on this sort of meadowland, with posh people wandering around carrying parasols. And I think in this day and age, I think we've got to leave behind that kind of romanticized idea of what the Downs should look like, and really think the Downs could be one of the major contributors in doubling the tree canopy in Bristol, which is the aim of the of Bristol City Council by 2046. And I think if areas like the Downs don't substantially increase the number of trees on them, I think with the chances of hitting that target is pretty much zero. And I can see no downside to it, because, as I say, all of the ledger activities, you could maintain all of those, and you could still have massive areas of meadowland as well, while still at least doubling or tripling the number of trees that are on the Downs. And bearing in mind, we're probably going to be losing 25% of our trees because of ash dieback. I think we ought to be thinking seriously about some substantial tree planting on the Downs. That's my own personal opinion.
Yeah, great. I'm sure there are going to be lots of people in here who'll agree with you and lots of people who'll think you're a monster, but I think it sounds good. I was going to move on. This is one for Nikki, I think. How do you decide whether to plant trees or let the land wild itself?
Well, that obviously depends on the land and the potential for rewilding. So the piece that we're just, or the 19 acres that we're looking to buy at Seend near Melksham, excuse me, isn't, it's not, although it's got great hedgerows and so on, I think there's less potential there for rewilding or for just natural regeneration. You know, it's been grazed for a very long period, whereas at Hazeland, basically what we've done at Hazeland is a mix. So we want to get basically what we're doing at Hazeland is restoring woodland that was taken down post 45. When we look at it, look at the maps from just a few decades ago, this was all woodland. So we're simply restoring what was there. We're just literally going for a mix. We have one field where we are just going to, it just lends itself. It's the last field on the east field, and it's quite a sort of lonely field, and it just lends itself very well to being left alone to do its own thing. It's got some great grass species. In the middle field, in the lower field, we are very ecology led. So we've had ecology reports throughout, and where they found whole areas, and there's substantial areas of species rich grass, we won't be planting trees at those. They'll be getting an annual conservation cut, and all around those we'll be planting more low growing shrubs and just one copse of trees. Our top field, which is quite species poor, and really just lends itself to, it's a very open field with really nothing around it, we will be planting trees. So it's a mix of what appeals to, of course we have to go with where funders want to go, but also knowing that we want to produce new permanent forest, it's how does the land lend itself to this decision making, basically. So I hope that's not clear.
Yeah, no, I thought that was very thorough. I mean, Avon Needs Trees is doing a mixture of both, and we will judge it as we come to it, listening to the ecologists. A very simple one for John, I think. The figures you gave on carbon sequestration rates for trees is 200 tons of CO2 for a mature oak over its lifetime, or per year, or what are we talking? You're muted, by the way.
Over its lifetime. The tree that I showed you, which is actually a tree which is in front of Churchill Hall of Residence in Stoke Bishop, we've calculated that to be, were planted round about the late 1400s. So it's taken a long time to accumulate that level of kind of biomass and the carbon that goes with it.
Wow. I
think a reasonable average for the amount of carbon that's sequestered per tree per year is about 22 kilograms. I've kind of based some of my calculations upon that kind of ballpark figure. So that's of a mature-ish tree will be sequestering that level of carbon within 1 year. So you can, if you're talking about offsetting, your flights to I don't know, Mallorca or whatever, and you want to work out how many trees you're going to need to plant, that's a good way of kind of working it out, although that does actually refer to mature trees rather than smaller trees. But no, it takes a long time to accumulate that amount of carbon. And oak trees are particularly good at doing it because they live such a long time.
Great. Nikki, will you be stocking larger animals to help with biodiversity at Hazeland and other sites?
Unfortunately, no, because we're a small charity and we just don't have the capacity to manage animals on site. So we won't be. I think people have obviously quite rightly got in mind projects like the Knepp Estate in Sussex, which many of you will have read about, and you know, I've actually been to visit, and everyone knows how impressive that is. That would be lovely to have some nice long-horned cattle roaming around and keeping the grass down for us and managing it. We don't really have the it's only 34 acres, and as I say, about 10 acres of that is already ancient woodland, so we don't really have the capacity to do that. But who knows what might happen in the future? You never know if we get big enough.
There's an interesting comment here, which I don't know if we need to go into in too much detail, about not wanting to plant trees on peatlands. Unfortunately, this is being proposed and has a negative carbon impact. I know, obviously, that's probably less of a factor in cities, but I know from the work that I've done with Avon Needs Trees is that you're quite selective over what sites you will pursue. Do you want to talk briefly about what kind of land you would consider purchasing?
John, do you want to talk about this first, or do you want me to go?
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the mantra that everybody's hearing at the moment is the right tree in the right place. And certainly, I think there is general agreement, peat, well, absolute agreement, that peat is not where we should be planting trees. And in fact, we wouldn't be allowed to. Well, I say that, although I did hear on Farming Today a couple of weeks ago that there is some forestry project up north where they're actually having to take out the trees because they were allowed plant on peat, and it's just been an absolute disaster. But that really is the exception. We have to, for planting more than 2 hectares, or for basically the change of use of more than 2 hectares, we have to apply for a change of use permit from the Forestry Commission. We have to submit an environmental impact assessment, and that includes full assessments of the geology, the soil, biodiversity on site and so on. And I don't think the Forestry Commission would have given us permission if we told them that there was peat, that we were planting on peat. But no, absolutely, we fully understand that, and we wouldn't want to plant on peat. Absolutely.
John, did you want to add anything on that, or can I move on to another question?
No, not really. I think it's, I think that's obvious.
Yep. Are some trees better than others at sequestration rates? I suppose some trees are better than others for supporting wildlife. Is there info available about which trees are most useful for different things?
Well, I mean, it's slightly difficult because one of the best ones is eucalyptus. They grow very rapidly and sequester carbon very quickly, but they don't have much of an ecological value. So I think whenever you're planting trees, you should be thinking about those two things. Something like oak is very slow growing, so it doesn't sequester carbon necessarily that quickly, but will do it for a long period of time. And of course, it's quite complex because if a tree has a certain lifespan, what happens to that tree when it dies? One of the things we've tried to encourage Bristol City Council to do is actually when they fell a tree is to actually leave that tree in place. And that means that the carbon that tree has sequestered doesn't then get released back into the atmosphere over a short period of time as a result of incineration. But I think really considering a number of factors, obviously a longer lived tree does have those benefits, but faster growing trees also will sequester carbon more quickly, but very often those aren't ones that are best ecologically. And when you look at the number of species that are supported by different trees, I pointed out earlier that an oak tree might support up to 2,300, whereas something like a plane tree, I think there's only about half a dozen that they claim to be supported by plane trees. So I think you've got to consider all factors, really.
Can I just say very briefly, at Hazeland, we've got one of John's colleagues from the University of Bristol doing research there, and he is what they're doing research into is whether they can accelerate the growth of some of the standard trees that we'd be planting, lime, beech, oak, and so on, by inoculating it with soil from the ancient woodland. And then another section of the research will be whether, again, they can accelerate the growth by putting leaf litter from the ancient woodland around the base of the trees. So helping to protect the trees, but also helping to feed it those microbials and mycorrhizal fungi and so on. So it's, you know, and basically the University of Bristol will be, this is a very long-term research project. They will be monitoring very, very precisely the carbon sequestration at Hazeland above and below ground, which is really, really exciting for us.
Yeah, great. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so there's no way we're going to get to all of these questions. So yeah, we will come up with a way to try and answer as many of them as we can, either written, or Nikki and John and I will have another Zoom and I'll just put the rest of the questions to them, or something like that if we can make it happen. But thank you everyone who has put in questions. They've been really, really good ones. I'm going to get to maybe 2 more if we've got time for them. This first one's a really good one. So there's a lot of interest in putting trees on streets as part of new pedestrianisation or low traffic schemes in parts of Bristol, but we've heard that trees don't do well in planters. Is it practical to plant them on streets? And I don't know how well you know Clifton, John, but could any go on a street as narrow as Princess Victoria Street in Clifton Village?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I think planters don't work very well, partly because you have to water them constantly and for the rest of their life. So they tend not to grow very big, they tend not to survive that long. In terms of, if you were to pedestrianise Princess Victoria Street, I think having trees down the middle would be brilliant. One of the advantages of putting trees down the middle of a street is the fact that most of the services tend to run down the side underneath the pavement, which is also a very good reason why it's difficult to plant a tree on pavements, particularly an area like that that's going to have all sorts of services running along there. So I think planters aren't great. If you are actually pedestrianising, having the trees in the middle of the street is absolutely ideal, because it's beneficial from all sorts of points of view. It's very difficult to plant them on pavements because the pavements are narrow. There's not enough room to get buggies by and wheelchairs and things like that. But also all the services are there as well. So it is a bit of a problem. And you know, the same applies in Bishopston. We did a tree survey around Bishopston a few years ago to see if we could find any additional street tree planting sites. It's actually very difficult to find any because the pavements tend to be so narrow.
Right, great. Do you know what? This is perfect. I'm going to end on one last question, which you're both welcome to answer, but which I think John might have a little more to say on. And it's the point of this whole thing. What did we call this talk? How to get more trees for Bristol. John and Nikki, what can everybody do in this meeting right now to get more trees for Bristol, and specifically our areas of Clifton, Cotham, Bishopston, and Redland?
Well, I think first of all, stop people chopping trees down.
Yes.
You know, we see loads of times when there's one objection I made to somebody who wanted to fell. It was actually an ash tree that was a perfectly healthy ash tree, and one of the motivations for not felling it was the fact that it may possibly be a resistant tree. Who knows? But it was because it was touching the roof of a house next door, and you know, the trivial reasons for chopping trees down. We need to persuade our councillors, persuade the tree officers not to support the felling of trees that already exist. In terms of planting new trees, it's very difficult. One of the problems is there aren't enough places to plant trees. But having said that, there are quite a lot of sponsorship sites. So if anyone wants to sponsor any trees, go on to the Bristol City Council sponsorship site, or you can actually go through the Bristol Tree Forum website. You want to do it that way. So there's ways of planting trees. Guerrilla planting is a way to go. I guerrilla planted quite a few trees on Redland Green. I've become very good at it, and I can actually make it look as though it's a formally planted Bristol City Council tree, and they invariably come along and adopt it afterwards and actually give it an asset number and everything. So But guerrilla planting obviously doesn't work on streets. You really need to get specific sites. If there are trees chopped down, make sure you don't lose that site. That's absolutely crucial, because once that site is lost, it then costs, you know, nearly 4 times as much to actually plant the tree there as it would to just replace the tree. But I think whenever you can, try and persuade your councillor to support trees, write to council officers, get involved in objecting to planning applications. We managed to get a planning application turned down on Ashley Road in St Paul's, which is threatening what was 5 maple trees there. And we actually had 400 people object to the application. And this is because we kind of provided information for them to do so. So objecting to applications to fell trees is a crucial part of this as well.
Can I just broaden that very, very much?
Go for it.
Beyond the question that was asked, but I think John's absolutely hit the nail on the head. The point is to stop trees being taken down. And of course, actually that's global, not just local. So it really is about buying recycled paper rather than FSC paper even. It's about where you get your meat from. It should be pasture for life. And if you're buying cheap grain-fed meat, you are probably contributing to the Amazon coming down, and so on. So that, you know, I'm sure we're all bombarded with those petitions, but those are really, you know, what's happening in the Amazon now is absolutely catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic for our planet. So, you know, and we all actually have a hand in this. The products come to us. So, you know, that's what we need to think about most, I think.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would like to persuade Bristol City Council to do, because any tree that is felled, what they do is they put it into their incinerator, where they do recover some energy, but nevertheless, all of that carbon goes into the atmosphere. The other thing you can do, and Nikki will be familiar with this because of the biochar issue, is you can use pyrolyzers, which actually retain most of the carbon, and that carbon can then be used to produce biochar, which can be used as a soil conditioner, and you can also produce biofuels as well as part of that process. So even if trees are felled, it's a really good idea if we can find ways of actually retaining the wood and not just putting it into an incinerator. Even burying it is a better way of doing it than burning it.
Actually, I would say I've just been put in touch with a young man from Somerset who's setting up a business to turn felled ash into biochar.
Yeah.
He has his own portable kiln. So if anybody, you know, is faced with a lot of ash in their area that's coming down and needs your services, then please get in touch.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there for now, at least. There are so many more brilliant questions, and I want to ask them all to Nikki and John, and maybe we will find a way to do that. But for now, thank you to both of our speakers. Thank you to all of you for coming. Frankly, you know, I've checked, this is the 11th at least. Actually, we've recorded 11 of them. There's others we didn't even get around to recording. We've been doing these for the last 6 months or so, and they've been great. It's been fantastic to get to put these sorts of events on for people who care passionately about important subjects, and on a whole variety of different topics. We've covered so many different aspects of our fight against climate change. It's been really, really rewarding, and thank you for letting me host them and giving me something to do every other Thursday. So thank you very much for coming. If you've enjoyed it, please check out our websites, join the mailing list, donate at paypal.me/Clifton Climate Action, please. We really, really appreciate it. Even £2, £3, £4, £5 would be amazingly appreciated. Avon Needs Trees, I know, have gift cards and Christmas cards and other things that you can buy for Christmas if you want to support them and help them buy that second piece of land. Also, you can just donate if you just want to give them cash for nothing. You just get that warm glow inside from knowing you've done a good thing. John, Bristol Tree Forum, people can support you. You've got a mailing list, I assume.
We're not particularly a money-orientated organisation, because that's not really where the problems lie. But certainly we do sponsor individual trees on occasions, and I would say if you don't want to give it to Bristol Tree Forum, go and sponsor a tree. Just do it directly. I think that's one of the good things that you can do, and And if they have a reason to do it, you can have a plaque put on the tree saying pretty much whatever you can within reason, I think.
Yeah, great. No, lots of things to go off and do. And as always, as I have to bring up last in every meeting, I don't know how this has become a tradition, Nicola, but please go and follow Clifton Climate Action on Instagram. CCA, it's Clifton Climate Act, and she's doing wonderful things on there. It's always going to be the last thing I bring up. I've decided that now, because I forgot about it for so many times until she reminded me, and now it's the last thing. Okay, it's late, and I'm missing the beginning of Taskmaster. So everybody go away, and we'll see you in 2021. Merry Christmas!